On this very story, we are now joined in studio by political commentator Jackie Shandu. Jackie, very good morning to you.
Good morning, and good morning to your viewers as well.
No, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Now,
Sure.
This separation of powers doctrine is all the talk right now with this application.
Sure.
But what does it mean? Because we're all of the understanding that, yes, the Constitutional Court cannot overreach. They cannot dictate terms on how National Assembly should operate, nor can they dictate terms to the Speaker of Parliament. But is there some level of accountability that they can enforce on that executive?
If you may please allow me to first pass heartfelt condolences to Sintiso Makaka, the former Secretary General of the ANC Youth League. May his soul rest in peace. To come to your question, look, man, it's tiring, you know, and even the broader public are getting tired of these stunts being pulled by the opposition. We know for a fact that COPE and UDM have no vision for this country, they have no ideas, they have no policies, they have no programs. So it makes sense that this kind of thing would be their program. It's much more disappointing for a party like the EFF, founded on very radical and progressive policies of transforming this economy, of emancipating the poorest of the poor, that they also have allowed themselves to be distracted, to be redirected, and now they too, their program is President Jacob Zuma. The Nkandla matter was dealt with. There was a process that was in place, and it went to court, and there was a judgment, you know. The president was made to pay what he had to pay because of those benefits that came to him unduly. The matter must be brought to rest. We must move on. We have far more pressing issues in this country that Parliament must deal with. You know, just not so long ago, we know what this country looks like in terms of poverty. 30 million South Africans declared poor. We don't have time for this kind of, you know, grandstanding in an attempt to score political points. This kind of thing, by the way, does not appeal at all to the vast majority of our people. This talks to the white minority sensibilities, you know, who, because of their socioeconomic situation, their social capital, these are the things that they have time.
So you're saying the ordinary man on the street is more concerned about the bread and butter issues? Tell me how I'm going to get a job.
You know, and that's what this institution called Parliament should be advancing. That is one of their key mandates, to come up with solutions as to how this process of transforming South Africa.
But they could argue, Jackie, that graft is something, or mismanagement of funds is something that they must also tackle in Parliament, because that's where that money will then be channeled to ordinary people in terms of bread and butter.
And that's why we commend the opposition, in particular the EFF, that it said there was something that needed to be done about that spending in Nkandla. They went on, they went to court, and they were corroborated by the judgment of the court. And there was a process, right? And the president has indeed paid. But let's move forward. Why do we keep going back and back and back? And I mean, even for the courts, I don't think this is, it's something that they embrace or welcome, because it does attempt for them to go beyond their mandate when we speak of the separation of powers, right? And now take decisions that are in some nature political. You must understand that the president is elected by the National Assembly. So after an election, the first sitting of the National Assembly is to elect president and so on and so forth.
Yes.
And that's the only body. In terms of Section 89 of the Constitution, it is again Parliament that can resolve by resolution, which also requires a 2/3 majority. That you are removing the president, gross violation of the Constitution or the law, serious misconduct or incapacity to fulfill those duties. That's the process. You can't draw the judiciary to now meddle in those political affairs. These are elected representatives of the country. There are millions of people who have voted in a particular way. Ours is a representative democracy, so parliaments then act on behalf of the people at large.
If we had to talk about the political solutions here, if we remember the process, just to refresh everybody's mind how we're getting to this point of now the impeachment.
Sure.
We had the ad hoc committee. Everybody went on that oversight visit. I remember myself, when we were all seeing these homes, suddenly that expression or phrase of palatial was debunked. And everybody said, certainly, that is not worth 249 million that everybody was talking about.
Right.
It seemed that Parliament was now divided, that perhaps on their part, they made a mistake not to go from the onset because they were talking about secure and comfort, and they didn't find any palatial sort of place when they got there.
Sure.
So what exactly did it mean had happened there? Was there inflation of costs by service providers, which have been held accountable? People within public works colluding with these service providers, as well as the chief architect, Minenhle Makanya.
Right.
Do you believe that that process there was concluded in that respect, that there was inflation, we need to confine it to public works and their disciplinary processes?
Look, I certainly agree with the fact that if you look at the quality of the work, and it doesn't justify that figure of 250 million. So somewhere, somehow, these funds have been misappropriated. And what then should have happened is an investigation that says who took more than what was due to them in terms of the work that they had delivered. And those are the people who then should have been brought to book to say, how do you charge us 10 million rand for 1 million rand's worth of work, right? You have defrauded public works, and you must face the law. That's how this thing should go. But how it moves from that process to a point where, I mean, as the NFP spokesperson was saying, there have been so many attempts, failed attempts. So it's clear now that it's no longer about what transpired and who committed some wrongdoing. It's this obsession with the figure of the president. By hook or crook, we want him out. That's not how it's done. The UDM, COPE, and EFF must go to the ground, must go to our people, persuade our people to vote otherwise, to elect a new government. That's how it's done in a constitutional democracy. But you are not going to abuse these institutions of this democracy, such as the judiciary, to advance your political cause. The opposition is clearly playing politics here. And I'm saying it's sad because these are also supposedly black political parties.
And it's a costly exercise.
Who understand the plight of our people. And it seems to us nothing. In the past couple of weeks, months, we hear nothing about poverty. From the EFF, from the UDM, from COPE, we hear nothing about the gross wealth inequalities, about land. Particularly, the EFF is founded on those principles. Land expropriation without compensation. We hear nothing about nationalization of mines. We hear nothing about tackling banks. There have been even some movements, some attempts by some people to try and get our banks in this country who exploit. You know, like there was a big 60 billion rands lawsuit on the banks in terms of how they repossess people's homes. You know, a 20-year bond, you've been paying a bond for 18 years. The last 2 years, something happens. The bank repossesses your property.
Yes.
And it sells it at how much you still owe them. Far below its value. Completely unjust, somewhat unlawful, completely immoral. These are the kinds of issues that we would think
politicians would tackle.
Particularly black politicians who come from the townships, who come from rural villages, who know the plight of our people. That's what we want Parliament to be about. That how are we going to pursue these banks? And how are we going to call them to order for them to stop exploiting our people? Especially parties like the EFF who say, we are the vanguard of the poor.
But then as political observers, like yourself as well as us, the media, is this not perhaps a test case? Our democracy is young. And ever so often, the Constitution is unpacked or clarified for us. We saw with the recommendations of the public protector, the former Thulima Donsela, we all found out that, yes, those recommendations are binding. Right. It seemed that they were divided on that. So don't you think that this will then provide that opportunity for either the judiciary to affirm that doctrine of separation of powers, to say, we won't do anything? So wouldn't you say that it's good that it's come to this point, we'll finally know?
Look, it's problematic. We understand it's here, but it still is problematic because it tells you that you have so-called political leaders who are completely detached from the society that they claim to lead. Because if they were deeply attached, in tune, in line, in solidarity with the people of this country, the vast multitudes of black people, they would be prioritizing fundamentally different issues. So this actually exposes the poverty of ideas within political parties. This matter has been dealt with. Let's put it to rest. Let's champion the issues, education, for instance. That crisis has not been resolved. And all this, we've never had COPE say anything about the crisis of fees and what needs to be done, or some document, some discussion. Never had Bantu Olympics say nothing. They don't care.
Mm-hmm. But is that not an indictment on us, the media, as well, that in most cases we want to discuss the middle class issues most of the time?
Yeah.
Not to say this is not a serious matter, whatever violations there may be or contraventions of the Constitution.
Correct.
But do you think it is an indictment on us to say, you're always talking about the nice life problems? Whereas there are real issues where people have nothing.
Absolutely
You
correct.
go to Barcelona in Western Cape and people are living in abject poverty. But we're only discussing what we know or is familiar to us, even as journalists, because we live in a space where we want to talk about the economy and other things as opposed to just the normal bread and butter issues.
And that is why the existence of this institution in particular, where we are, the NN7, is so crucial. Because prior to the existence of the NN7, you had complete monopoly, complete white hegemony in the media space. And obviously, that determines the kinds of issues that the media will prioritize. TV channels, the press, what have you. And so that you find that for the longest time in this democracy, you have not had a media institution influential enough to be the voice of the voiceless up until the formation of this station, which is under attack for that very reason. Why? Because the narrative, others want the narrative to remain a very white, liberal narrative that speaks about petty bourgeois issues that, affect the white minority and these few blacks who have filtered into the bourgeoisie. And the tens of millions of suffering Africans, no one wants to talk about Slwecha or Kailicha or Tofimvaba in the Eastern Cape. People who are still struggling to access water. It's real in this country. And I'm saying Bantu Olomisa from one of those villages, rural villages in the Eastern Cape. We would think logic would dictate this guy, those are some of the issues that he would be championing. Mom, we've never had anything. The less said about Lekota, the better. This is what we are doing. The poverty, the opposition is so petty and it is so ideologically bankrupt in this country. It tells you that with all its weaknesses, the ANC is going to continue to lead this country because there is no viable alternative, just nothing. And it's the opposition that exposes its own poverty of ideas and its lack of commitment to our people who are still excluded, who are still exploited. You have issues like farm workers who are still not covered
No,
in
JP,
the
it's
Labour Relations
certainly
Act.
worth a broader conversation, I must say, how we bring the ordinary people into this national discourse by talking about issues that affect us all. But thank you very much for joining us. That's Jackie Shandu, a political commentator, talking to us about the impeachment of President Jacob Zuma.